infernal bombardment. The noise, the smoke.
The most tremendous cannonade I've ever heard. Swept round us in a wide curve of red leaping flame, quite unending in either direction.
It's a whole new type of warfare, boys. Gotta be careful.
They're calling them stormtroopers. Jerry's best. Got orders to leave their trenches and charge right into us.
Come on, concentrate on your bayonet. Imagine it piercing the hearts of the Hun. Every last one of them.
Salutations, soldiers of the St. Quentin Salient. Automatic here for Automatic Games, bringing you yet another installment of my Battlefield 1 series. This one entitled St. Quentin Scar, and it takes us to the Western Front. Previously, we've had a glimpse of the Western Front in the 3rd episode of Friends in High Places. And I took the opportunity during that video to discuss an ancestor of mine that was involved, rather than talk about the ins and outs of the Western Front at large, which, by the way, is a yeoman's task. But I'll try to use broad strokes. Hey, let's start off with a cinematic and then we'll get to it.
The German attack is imminent. Here are your orders. The blue line trenches must be held. If we get overrun, we will fall back to Venture Farm over here. If we can't make a stand at this position, we will retreat to the village of Traversy. Should they break through, we must stop them by the mills.
To even begin to explain what brings us to this moment in time on the Western Front, we must first turn our attention to the Eastern Front, where Russia has pulled out of the war. The reason behind this is the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Tsar and Tsarina have been deposed, and following their fall from grace, there was one major conflict which the Russians took part in and lost. After that, they decided to capitulate. The Tsar and Tsarina fell victim to the Bolshevik Revolution, and so as they left the stage, entered the Bolsheviks and the Soviets. Now, the fall of Russia as part of the Triple Entente presents a rare opportunity to the German High Command. And General Ludendorff, General Erich Ludendorff, he's Germany's Army Chief of Staff and a notorious general in World War I. He seizes upon the opportunity, taking over 1 million soldiers, loading them onto trains, and shuttling them to the Western Front to bolster his efforts there. He's hoping that this will tip the balance, and time is of the essence. He intends to launch a massive group of operations called the Kaiserschlacht. Now, St. Quentin is part of the part of Operation Michael, the opening phase of the Kaiserschlacht. Another important thing has happened in 1917 besides Russia pulling out, and that is the United States has entered the war, though at this time being spring of 1918, they still have less than 200,000 men in Europe, but more are coming. Now, what brought the United States into the war is Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which took effect on February 1st of 1917. Now, the Germans, they weren't naive. They knew that once they launched this, the United States would more than likely enter the war. So, they sent the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico, saying that when this comes to pass, we would like you to enter the war on our side. And as a result, as a reward, you will gain much of the southwestern United States. Well, the British intercepted this particular message from the ambassador to Mexico, and they released it to the United States, and public opinion was swayed. Now we wanted into the war. And so Wilson declared war. I should say Congress declared war, but Wilson, of course, made the case with his famous 14-point speech, and among others. And so, yeah, General Ludendorff could see that the Allies were going to get an influx of soldiers. And so he wanted to launch the Kaiserschlacht before the United States could get here en masse. Now, as I noted, Operation Michael was the opening phase of it. And the Allies kind of knew this was happening. They could see that the troops were being moved. They could see that more artillery was being brought in. And so we were aware that the Germans were up to something. Many thought that the Germans wanted to move up north and seize the harbors along the English Channel. And that might have been true. Really what Ludendorff wanted to do was just attack all along the line, and wherever there was a breakthrough, he wanted to exploit that. Typically, wherever your men stall out, that's where you're going to throw your reserves. But what he wanted to do is note where he saw successes and send the reserves there to further exploit those successes. And he would use 1 million men to do this, with 2 million in reserve. These are gargantuan numbers, folks. And so yeah, as far as St. Quentin is concerned, as displayed by this particular video, there was a great fog on the morning that the cannonade opened up, and it opened up at about 4:35 a.m. The infantry wouldn't start moving until a little later in the morning, but they would be cloaked in this shroud of mist. And that really obviously helped out the stormtroopers. Oh yeah, let's talk about stormtroopers. Ludendorff decided to pull men from various groups down to the squad level. He took the best of the best and reformed them into stormtrooper groups who got the best equipment and the best training. So yeah, the stormtroopers were a fighting force to be reckoned with by any standard, and they'd be launching their offensive against this area near St. Quentin, among others, where they would encounter breastworks, trenches. The game already mentioned the fact that that first line of trench was called the blue line. Behind that you would find the red line. Where Private Cushing is now is where the green line would be. I say would be because at this point, March 1918, the green line was still under construction. Those trenches had not quite been dug yet. And that might elicit a decent question, which I'll get to momentarily, but first I want to talk about the tactics that the defenders intended to employ. They wanted to use a defense-in-depth strategy. That is, the first line, that blue line, that would just have a scattering of forces. They would act as sentries to spot the oncoming Germans, put up a bit of a defense, but mainly a fighting withdrawal to the red line, where the Allies would position the bulk of their defensive forces. What this would allow for is it would give the red line time to get their troops into position once the Germans came on. And it would also give the artillery a prearranged area that they could already zero in on between the blue line and the red line, thereby increasing the chances of them scoring accurate hits against the oncoming waves of Germans. So, yeah, going back to that question that I said might be elicited, one might ask, why hasn't the third line of trench been dug yet? I mean, hell, these armies have been here since 1915, haven't they? And that'd be a poignant observation, but the easy answer is no. These armies have not been here since 1915, not in this specific sector anyway. The reason why is because when Ludendorff took command on the Western Front, he was frustrated by the state of the German lines. These weren't exactly straight lines by any stretch of the imagination. There were bulges and salients, and in some cases the lines didn't even necessarily connect. So to address that, he decided to pull back his troops, which would be seen as an unconventional maneuver at the time. He was, in effect, ceding territory to the Allies. But what he wanted to do was pull them back to a more cohesive line, which would culminate in the Siegfried Line, also known as the Hindenburg Line, named after Paul von Hindenburg, the Field Marshal and General Chief of Staff for the German Army. And so, yeah, as the Germans fell back, they employed a bit of a scorched earth policy. They destroyed villages, they destroyed their own trenches, any buildings or defensible positions that they did leave behind, they booby-trapped for the Allies that would inevitably come and take position there. And so, yeah, the Allies, as the Germans fell back, the Allies were compelled to move forward, in effect, just to maintain a line of sight with the enemy trenches, which in some cases the two opposing sides were only separated by about 1,000 yards. So, yeah, the Allies moved forward to this previously unmanned area, or if they were manned by the Germans. And so, yeah, they had to set about the business of digging trenches all over again. And that is why the Green Line, the third line of defense, had not yet been dug. Now, the Allied soldier, they obviously had some trepidation because they knew something was going on with the Germans. After all, they understood that the Germans were getting all these reinforcements. They knew that more artillery cannons were being brought in. And so, yeah, there was a great deal of worry on the part of the Allies. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Germans, they had a similar sense. This is not to say that was the case on the home front. Now, there were food shortages back in Germany, and but here in the spring of 1918, with these new developments, Ludendorff was exuding this air of confidence. The German people thought they might be on the cusp of victory. And so there was a bit of confidence on the part of the German population. But as to the individual soldier in the trench, not so much, which is indicative of any soldier that knows he's about to be ordered into combat. To evidence that, I'll share with you a quote from Lieutenant Rudolf Hoffmann of the 463rd Hansa Towns Regiment. And I quote,
"Most of the men were very quiet, some told a few jokes. One, I remember, took out a letter and a photograph of his wife, and looked at it. He didn't say anything. They were all thinking of home. Possibly half of the men went to a quiet part of the trench and said their prayers. I, too."
Unquote. So yeah, there wasn't, there was a little bit of solace on the part of those soldiers. As for Private Stanley here, he found a horse and he's getting the hell out of here. Now, Private Stanley's individual act of cowardice can certainly be juxtaposed by individual acts of bravery, which are far more common in terms of the average soldier. I'm struck by the courage on display, by commands that fought until ammunition was exhausted and they were surrounded by stormtroopers. Only then did they surrender. Or, moreover, by commands that fought to the very last man, to the very last breath. These unimpeachable acts of bravery definitely overshadow the little instances of fear that you see on display. Now, as for Stanley, maybe that's like me in this battle. Maybe that's what I do, because I'm 10% of the man that you might find among those that fought in the Great War. Now, as for this Zeppelin, and I've said this before, no Zeppelin on the Western Front flew over a battlefield, let alone that low. If you were going to see a Zeppelin over an active battlefield, it would be on the Eastern Front and way early in the war and at much higher altitudes. Now we're going to take on the identity of Farmer Claude, resident of the village of Travesey here, who owns the little abode up here on the right. Frankly, I want to see how his property fares, and moreover, see how he fares, as the front has moved into his neck of the woods. In the meantime, I want to talk about some of the allegations that DICE or EA makes at the beginning of this particular mission. They say that 3 million shells are fired by 10,000 cannons, that the shots can be heard in London. And these kind of liberal estimates they smack of what you'd read on Wikipedia, which is undeniably unreliable. I tend to read regimental histories when it comes to American regiments. In Europe, a lot of times they're called regimental diaries or regimental war records. Currently, I'm reading the 9th Battalion, the King's Royal Rifle Corps War Records, which is extremely compelling, and I'm mainly reading it because of their involvement in the St. Quentin sector. But anyways, the first-hand account sources are the ones that always speak volumes to me. And I read some, in fact a German one, an artillery regiment that talks about, artillery battalion that talks about the bombardment before St. Quentin, and they cite 1.1 million shells fired, not 3 million, and they say 6,600 cannons were involved. Well, that's pretty conservative compared to 3 million and 10,000. Then again, when it comes to cannons involved, they say that there were 3,000 mortars complementing those cannons, so maybe that's how you arrive at 10,000. I don't know. And as to whether or not you could hear the sound of the cannonade in London, oh, there goes Farmer Claude. Well, yeah, as to that, I don't know, I don't know if I believe that or not. I tend to be skeptical of it, but you're at liberty to believe whatever you want on that note. Certainly that story has been handed down over the generations, and maybe there is an ounce of truth to it. But personally, I kind of slowly push it aside. Now, I'll also say that you heard some quotes at the beginning of this level, which are actually quotes that could be attributed to Winston Churchill. Parts of them, anyways. It's a butchered quote. I would have rather they just use his quote and cite him for it, but instead they use parts of what he says and they mix it in with other soldiers, and they give him a Cockney accent too, which is strange. If you've ever heard Churchill speak, it's not that, but nonetheless, I wouldn't mind sharing his actual quote that they gleaned that from with you. At the time, he was Minister of Munitions, and he was positioned with the 9th Scots Division in Nurlu, which was nearby, so he had something to say about the cannonade, and this was it. I quote,
"And then, exactly as a pianist runs his hands across the keyboard from treble to bass, there arose in less than 1 minute the most tremendous cannonade I shall ever hear. It swept round us in a wide curve of red leaping flame stretching to the north far along the front of the 3rd Army, as well as of the 5th Army on the south, and quite unending in either direction. The enormous explosions of the shells upon our trenches seemed almost to touch each other, with hardly an interval of space or time. The weight and intensity of the bombardment surpassed anything which anyone had ever heard before."
End quote. Well, yeah, so there you got little segments of what, well, EA used little segments of that, I should say. And I guess I would have rather them use the actual quote and then cite them, but who cares, right? Anyhow, I guess let's talk about, we talked about the Allied trenches, let's talk about the German trenches. Just at the onset of this assault, they actually ran right through the municipality of St. Quentin. So St. Quentin, this isn't St. Quentin. St. Quentin was actually on the German lines. They'd already captured it by that point. The developers don't claim otherwise, but I feel obligated to mention that you're not going to see the city of St. Quentin on this map. It's just that we're fighting in such a close proximity to that city, and it's the largest municipality around, so that's where the name derives itself from. If you were to look online, you would see photos of St. Quentin following Operation Michael, with just tons of prisoners lining the streets. Crowding the streets, really. That's some of the 20,000 plus prisoners that were taken in these initial phases. And in the background, the facades of the buildings and the storefronts show the scars of warfare. Now, St. Quentin is a pretty decent-sized city. It doesn't hold the vital strategic importance that like, Amiens does. But, in fact, mentioning Amiens, I should say that that wasn't necessarily a target at the onset of this operation. But, as I mentioned before, Ludendorff was just trying to figure out as he went along how this situation would develop. He was going to hit things where things looked sackable. And sure enough, this vital railway junction looks ripe for the taking. So, as long as the army could provide the logistical support to his stormtroopers, they had a good chance of sacking that place. And so that's what he set his sights on. Now, granted, the next episode in this series is called Amiens, so we're going to discuss that at great length in that video. And certainly this video has had a focus on the initial gains on the part of the German army. But before I get to work on that next video, I guess I've still got a few minutes of footage left here, and I'll dedicate that time to talking about maybe one of the regimental histories that I've come across recently. Of course, the one I'm reading now is the 9th Battalion. One that I'm just off the heels of reading is the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And you know what? I'll talk about the 9th. That is the King's Royal Rifle Corps. Because they held an interesting position on the Blue Line. As you might expect, they discussed the fusillade in the morning, the artillery cannonade, and they talked about how it knocked out all of the telephone poles, and so it severed the telephone wires that would connect them to brigade headquarters and also divisional headquarters. And as if that weren't bad enough, then comes the fog. And that was Mother Nature's contribution to the German war effort that day, I guess, because at that rate, the 9th could go ahead and fire signal flares, but headquarters ain't going to see it. And they couldn't launch, really, in good conscience, their courier pigeons, because courier pigeons notoriously got lost in the fog. So they were pretty much cut off, isolated, as battalions around them were falling. In fact, so you know, the artillery barrage starts at about 4:35 a.m., 3 to 4 hours later, the infantry starts coming in just behind a walking artillery barrage. And the first sign that the 9th gets that there's infantry in their area is a runner from an adjacent battalion who comes over and says, "There's Germans on the St. Quentin Road, and our commanding officer is dead." And then they realize what kind of storm they're in. In the midst of the fog, they managed to capture a German officer. I forget what, maybe a colonel or something, but he's out there all alone, and you know, they're puzzled. They're like, "What are you doing out here by yourself?" And he says, "Well, my troops got way out ahead of me, and I lost track of them." He had some maps on him, and they looked at his maps and realized that his slated targets were all like 6 miles to the rear of the Blue Line. That's that, coupled with the fact that he says, "Our forces are attacking on a 2-kilometer wide front this morning." That's when they realize the scope and size of what's coming at them. And throughout the day, other German detachments realize that this little area of trench and a few of the strong points are still held by Allies, and so they turn their attention toward it, but are repelled by the 9th. Until the fog clears. Once the fog clears, the 9th decides to fire up some signal flares, but they immediately regret that decision because the second wave of Germans coming in sees it, takes it for what it is, and they dedicate 500 men to laying siege to that portion of the Blue Line. Sure enough, their siege proves successful, although the 9th puts up a stiff resistance. And finally, when they get to talking to their German captors, the Germans tell them that even their headquarters is past the Blue Line already. That just kind of goes to show the 9th Battalion that they were in a spot. But they held, as men do. Well, that's about all the time I have, and yes, this particular soldier, Lieutenant McFadden, he is shirking. He's running. But, you know, I appreciate you watching. I'm Automatic for Automatic Games. If you like this video, like this video. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon, friends.